I'm not sure how prominent, but thank you, Jen. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Joanne, for having me. So I have practiced law for 35 years, and in some respects, I feel like a startup. And I hope I'm lean and mean, although nice to clients. Because, of course, you have to be cost conscious in a small firm, and there isn't that much margin for error. Let me speak about a couple of things. You may have seen in the materials, I have something from marketing to resolution. But first, substantively, what do you focus on? And do you focus on one area of law, 2 areas of law, 3 areas of law, whatever? I recall when I was in law school, I saw a talk show that was done by a guy who originated in Philadelphia, Tom Snyder, but he had a national talk show. And his guest one night was Leon Jaworski. Has anyone heard of Leon Jaworski? He may have actually sort of impliedly been in the news recently because when President Trump fired the acting attorney general, it was compared to the Saturday Night Massacre. Well, the Saturday Night Massacre happened during the Nixon-Watergate days, and Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the then special prosecutor, and this sort of, at least unknown to many people. Cox was a Harvard law professor, well known, had a high profile, but Leon Jaworski became the special prosecutor. And he did a very good job. So 6 years later, I'm at Penn, and I'm across the street at Hill House, where I was a resident fellow. I don't even know if they have Hill House functioning anymore. And I was an insomniac, so I stayed up and watched this show called Tomorrow, and Jaworski's the guest. What does Jaworski say? Well, when I started practicing law in Texas in the 1920s, you could be a generalist. You could handle many different cases. And if you read about his career, you'll see he defended people who were on death row in Texas in the 1920s, and he was actually a prosecutor, not at Nuremberg, but he prosecuted some court-martial cases and so forth for the U.S. Army, and he had a very varied background. But he said, and this is him speaking in the fall of 1979, law is too specialized. You cannot do many things. And I remembered that. I didn't have the benefit of this course. I had a father who was a lawyer, and I'll get to that, or I'll get to him, but it really resonated with me. And I said, I'll go out of my mind if I try to do more. And it was very fortuitous because I entered law school very interested in torts. And torts essentially is personal injury. You don't do much trespass on the case or whatever stuff you're taught those first few weeks. Torts the tort practice area is essentially personal injury. So I knew in consultations with my lawyer father that I would have to study torts if I wanted to do that, and I'd have to study evidence. I never worked as hard in my life in any course as I did in evidence. I tried to learn every nuance. We talked about hearsay and so forth, and I wasn't necessarily in all courses the most serious of law students, but in evidence I certainly was. And why? Because along with Jaworski's advice, I had my father's advice, and he said, if you want to try cases, you better know evidence. So there I was, taking note after note in evidence. And those two messages, the actual specific one from my father and the one from Leon Jaworski, I think looking back 35 or so years served me well. So I would say focus and don't be a jack of all trades, master of none. Just, I think, the opposite. There are certain things, and I'll just go into my background and how hard it is to predict what the future will be. We all have our plans, but life deals certain twists and turns that you don't expect at a relatively young age. So I started practicing in the very early 80s, and as I say, I wanted to do torts and personal injury work. So what's the best way to learn that? The best way is to learn it from the other side, the defense side, the insurance liability side. And I was fortunate. I was hired at this, which for this kind of work was considered a very large firm of 80 lawyers, and they had some very, very accomplished Boston trial lawyers. And I worked there for a couple of years, and I had intended possibly to go to Florida and try cases for the Dade County Attorney's Office. And the reason I knew about that is there was a grad from 1968, Murray Greenberg, was actually involved in the Florida recount in 2000. And he offered me a job in Florida, but I chose to go home to Boston, and I took that job with the, relatively speaking, very large firm. But I always thought it might be fun to try cases on a regular basis for Dade County. It wasn't criminal work, it was civil work. So I was going to work for a couple of years as an associate in the firm I mentioned, although not by name, that firm, but I mentioned that firm, and then I was going to go to Florida and try cases. Well, one night in 1983, my father had a heart attack and died. Obviously, I wasn't expecting or preparing that, and he had his little firm. He was very well educated, graduated law school in the late 1930s, but couldn't get a job in the very closed Boston legal market. So he formed after World War II, he formed a small law firm with a childhood friend. And I decided 6 or so months after he passed away that I would leave this firm as an associate and go into this small firm. One of the things that frightened me when I did that is I lost the mentors. I lost these people who were extremely experienced trial lawyers, very few of whom actually were trying cases, because I hardly saw any cases tried while I was an associate at this, again, relatively speaking, big firm. But I needed to know how to try cases because I knew someday that would happen. As a matter of fact, in 1984, I was at a motion, and these pretrial motion sessions, they might have had in those days 30 lawyers on 30 different cases. And there I am, picking up one of my father's cases that had been neglected for 8 or 9 months. And the judge, a very nasty man, who I didn't know at that time, said to me, "Is this case ready to be tried?" Well, when you're a defense lawyer, as I had been for an insurance company, you always are ready. And in those years, it would take 5 years to get a case tried. So you'd say you're ready for trial. They said, okay, we'll put it down on the list, and then 2 years later, they'd see you. So anyway, I'm asked by this judge in 1984, is this case ready for trial? So I said, yes, it is. He said, good, we'll try it now. So he was a sadistic man. I'll save more remarks about him if you want anything. So he calls the jury pool down, the veneer. And he says to the veneer, now mind you, I was at this major litigation firm, but never had seen a case tried. And he says to the veneer, they're in the back, these 80 people, and they're looking at me, and I'm 27, 28 years old, and I'm probably looking like I'm 18. And anyway, he says to the veneer, now I'll tell you what goes on in a jury trial. And I'm thinking, good, tell me, because I don't know. So I got through it, believe it or not. We ended up settling that case after a couple of days, and so on and so forth. There are sort of some funny stories about that. But the notion of trying cases when you do litigation can be a frightening thing, and it's something you have to prepare for. So what did I do without mentors? I took every continuing legal education class I could. If they said when questioning a witness, go 3 feet to the left of the lectern, I'd write down, question witness 3 feet to the left of lectern. That's how, seriously I took it, and so forth. But the marketing of cases, how you get cases, it can be, daunting, and it can make the difference, obviously, between a successful law firm and a failed law firm. I'm very fortunate that I got into marketing on the internet about 10 years ago, which is in some respects early. And that has changed, in a good way, the nature of my practice. I do get referrals from other attorneys, but when you can split a fee, and that's ethical, but when you do that, you're not necessarily getting cases that are so easy, let's put it that way, because they're usually a problem, otherwise that attorney might have taken it. And I, as I say, I do exclusively, and have done for 35 years and 32 and a half on my own, I do exclusively personal injury. So how do you set yourself apart or distinguish yourself when there are 10,000 other people, literally 10,000 other people, who might claim to do the same area of law? And there's another, and this is rather uncomfortable to even discuss, but you need to know what the world is from my perspective, and that is there are unscrupulous lawyers, especially in the personal injury business. And I'm not just talking about the so-called ambulance chases who advertise or put their names or faces on billboards and things like that. That's actually legal in advertising for lawyers, however tasteless, is legal and has been for decades. I'm speaking about some horrendous lawyers who may split fees with non-lawyers and use them as, quote, runners and so forth. And many major cases go that route. In fact, I actually want to relate a vignette to you. I went to the American Association of Justice, which is a 55,000 member organization, a reputable organization. It was formerly known as the American Trial Lawyers Association. But trial lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers, feel so beaten up that they have their focus group inquire of consumers, and they want to know, do you have a bad stereotypical feeling about trial lawyers? And the answer is yes. So they changed the name to the American Association for Justice because everything is focus group driven by this group. So what happened is I went to the seminar, very, very in this field, high-end kind of seminar, and they had a very good New York trial attorney speak, and he handled construction cases. These construction cases, the poor laborers are often mangled, obviously, beyond belief. I saw in the Inquirer yesterday that there was a joint settlement of 20 victims of a building collapse for maybe 200-something million. Anyway, this gentleman, who seemed to be a very good trial attorney, said from the podium, and I can't believe it, when I get these good cases, I take care of the union boss who would have sent him the case. And that kind of like flagrant disregard and indifference, just was remarkable to me and unscrupulous. But that's what you face, at least in my neck of the woods, in terms of getting good cases. So when the internet came about, and marketing on the internet came about, I was delighted because you can, in some ways, distinguish yourself. You're often compared to the abilities of other lawyers, and as I said, the personal injury client may not be that sophisticated, but on the other hand, some may be sophisticated enough to see who's a charlatan and who is the real thing. So I'll get to how you develop your firm on the internet. And the news is pretty good because it's relatively cheap, it's leveled the playing field, and you can use some of the knowledge you've learned in this building to do things, and we'll get into it if you're interested. Blogs. I do, as far as I know, I'm the only lawyer who does video blogging. So every week or so, I do a video and a written blog on an area of, or an aspect of the kind of law I do that interests me. And I'm not just saying this to be, to resonate with you, but many of the things I talk about are things I actually learned here. I either learned in torts, learned in civil procedure, certainly what I learned in evidence and what I learned even in insurance law. So it's amazing how useful that can be. And there's all kinds of metrics that determine how long somebody stays on your site and so on and so forth. And Google knows all that. Google, I often say, is the closest thing to God we'll know in this lifetime. So they reward you with higher rankings on the internet. But there's also a whole issue we need to discuss, which is, of course, the management of a small firm. You want to keep costs down, like many of you rightly thought. And what does that mean? That means you might become the chief cook and bottle washer, or whatever that expression is. So the last couple of days I was thinking, what kind of advice can I impart to you? What mistakes did I make? I certainly have made mistakes, as anyone would. But one of the things is I probably erred too much, and I'm not, as I'm told, a cheap person, so I might have erred too much on building too slowly. So therefore, I had to wear too many hats. And in wearing so many hats, I couldn't necessarily market in the ways I might have. I never neglected the study of the substantive area of law. That I went to. I made time for seminars and so on and so forth. Bought in those days tapes. Now, of course, you can download everything for $900. You can get access to the entire continuing legal education library.